It's difficult to pinpoint the exact amount of influence the hashtag #MeToo movement has had on modern filmmaking, but one interesting development I've noticed is the increase of films that revolve around men's sexual misconduct towards women. Sometimes this is in the form of documentaries, like She Said, a film about the reporting behind Harvey Weinstein's allegations of abuse. But for this video, I'm going to look at two examples of recent fictional storytelling, Ridley Scott's The Last Duel and Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. The most obvious differences between both films are the time period and setting, with Wright's film crossing back and forth between London in the 1960s and the present day, while The Last Duel is set in 14th century France. Where both movies cross paths is their refusal to paint the past in a rose-tinted light, exploring how sexual misconduct against women was an ongoing occurrence, often hushed up or downplayed to preserve an illusion of safety that never actually existed. The Last Duel has a very interesting structure, where we witness the events leading up to and following the rape of Marguerite de Carouge by Jacques Legris through the perspectives of Jean de Carouge, Marguerite's husband, Jacques, and finally, Marguerite herself. Each perspective contradicts the other, but from the film's messaging, promotion, and even some clever choices with its titles introducing each of the film's three sections, it's clear that Marguerite's version of events most closely resembles the truth. For Jacques and Jean, their pride clouds their accounts of the past, but it also inhibits their empathy. Jacques is obviously lying about his innocence, but on some level he probably believes it. It's just that it would be too much of an attack to his ego to admit that a woman didn't want to sleep with him. As for Jean, he's as unsympathetic as they come. When Marguerite tells him what happened, he chokes and threatens her, demanding her to tell him the truth over and over. It seems intentional that when Marguerite tells Jean that she could not get away from Jacques because she couldn't breathe, her own husband is choking her. Even though Jean is at least willing to protect his wife and honor her, it's never for the right reasons. Jean clearly enjoys the thought of chivalry, yet rarely expresses it around Marguerite. Once he decides to believe her confession, he focuses only on how this affects him, then demands that she sleep with him. He even proposes a fight to the death against Jacques, which will result in Marguerite being burned alive if he loses, without telling her beforehand. Marguerite's husband is cold and apathetic, too concerned with his status and ego to care about her. Her friends abandon her, and even her mother-in-law tries to convince her to drop the accusation, when she was also raped many years ago. After making the accusation, Marguerite has no allies, no friends, and no support system left. Ultimately, she's just lucky that her husband was able to defeat Jacques in battle, killing him. Marguerite is trapped in a society that will never take her pain seriously, only pretending to do so for the performative acts of chivalry by the men around her. Though she finds comfort and happiness in being a mother, these traumatic experiences will still impact her throughout her life. Here, the story ends, where there is no real sense of accountability or justice. For Ellie, the protagonist of Last Night in Soho, London is a source of fear. It's where her mother was consumed by her mental illness, prompting her suicide, and it's also where she has to learn to be an independent adult. Since she's quite shy and reserved, she struggles to fit in amongst some of her overconfident, rude classmates. On her first night in the city, she is rejected by her peers and harassed by a taxi driver. For someone as innocent and sensitive as Ellie, her surroundings seem ugly and cruel in comparison. She finds an escape in her dreams, where she witnesses the journey of Sandy, an aspiring singer in 1960s London, who, like Ellie, is a young woman looking to make her dreams come true in new surroundings. Of course, it doesn't remain that rosy for long. Each night, Ellie becomes more invested in these dreams, as Sandy is coerced and threatened into entering sex work by her supposed manager, Jack. Not long after, as Ellie's life becomes little more than a waking nightmare, violent images of Sandy's bloody and brutal death begin to haunt her, whether she's asleep or awake. She even begins to see ghosts all over London. In many ways, Ellie seems too naive for the harshness of the world around her. Sandy's fate is already essentially set in stone. What she had to endure occurred decades ago. Yet Ellie almost seems to believe that she can save her. For as empathetic as she is, Ellie's assessment of Sandy is clouded by her innocence. In reality, Sandy killed Jack to defend herself, but then went on to murder her clients in cold blood. Sandy experienced firsthand the depressing reality some women had to suffer through, and used that trauma to inaccurately judge her clients, since they are technically contributing to the ruined life of a girl who once had bright eyes and big dreams. But these men still have their own identities outside of Sandy's tortured mindset. The ultimate test for Ellie, then, is whether she will succumb to Sandy's vengefulness. At the very start of the film, she does so with John, a fellow fashion student who asks her if she's okay after she was harassed by the taxi driver. Because she's just been provoked by a male stranger, she is cold and dismissive to John, who is also unknown to her at this point. She also assumes that Leslie, an old man who remembers Sandy from years ago, must have killed her, and accidentally causes his death by calling out to him, causing him to stop in the middle of the road before he is run over and killed. It turns out that he was a police officer, and that's how he knew of Sandy. On at least one occasion, he actually tried to help her, warning her that she was too good for her current profession. But Ellie has become too blinded by her sympathy for Sandy to think of Leslie in a positive light. Even as her relationship with John deepens, and the two become attracted to one another, Ellie finds her violent waking nightmares stopping her from continuing to be with John. For example, just as they are about to sleep with one another, she vividly imagines Sandy being raped. In so many of her dreams, Ellie is desperate to save Sandy, wishing she could tear down the invisible boundary between them and protect her. But in the real world, it's as if Sandy is doing the same thing to Ellie by trying to ruin her opportunity to fall in love with John. This way, she won't experience love, but she also won't get hurt. It's at least somewhat successful, since Ellie does end up almost killing one of her classmates. Granted, she was being chased by a bunch of creepy ghosts, but no one knows that except for her. She is inadvertently mimicking her mother's mental decline, while also accidentally giving in to what Sandy would want her to do. Even with all this trauma, Ellie is still naive. She never once stops to think that her landlord could be Sandy, even though she is an elderly woman whose home is where Sandy lived during the assault she suffered and her subsequent killing spree. Revealing her identity, Sandy sets fire to the building and attempts to kill Ellie. It's entirely possible that Ellie is just too innocent for the world's darkness. After all, Sandy could never find inner peace even after all these years. As she stalks Ellie upstairs, preparing to kill her, she witnesses the ghosts of the men she has killed in her old bedroom. Even now they continue to haunt her, with her manager Jack still having control over her all these years after his death. Ellie's empathy for Sandy is what almost got her killed, but it's also what saves her life, as Sandy urges her to escape the burning building with John. Sandy was right to implore Ellie to save herself, since clearly she has, coming out the other end of a harrowing experience with her optimism and vulnerability intact. When she completes her end-of-year fashion runway, she approaches Sandy and her mother, watching her in the reflection of a mirror, and touches it, bridging the gap between illusion and reality, and drawing the memory of these two women closer to her, as she had tried but failed to do so many times before. Just like she did for Sandy, it's obvious that if the opportunity arose, Ellie would fight to honor Marguerite's memory for what she suffered through. While Marguerite is a historical figure, whereas Sandy is purely fictional, both characters can be seen as composites of countless women who have endured similar abuses. So many of these women's stories are already lost in time, having fallen through the cracks of history after being buried, whether by intentional concealment or just plain apathy. Thankfully, because of the women who have voiced the abuses they have suffered through, particularly within the entertainment and filmmaking industries in recent years, we can expect more films just like these to bring light to this much-needed perspective.